This morning, organizations got together to honor veterans of the Coastal Bend. The MSD Honor Group and veterans were given a delicious breakfast at the Altus Hospice office. Different sponsors also helped with the event, which made veterans like Richard Gallagher happy to know that veterans are appreciated.
I'm just honored to be here. It's great. Anytime we can get with veterans and show support for them for what they've done for us, it's an honor.
Nourishing for our bodies.
Some of the groups involved in the event are in charge of serving and presenting flags and throwing dignity ceremonies for the deceased. A blessing for all the veterans was held at the start of today's event.